Skinwalker Ranch, located in Utah, is one of North America's most mysterious locations. Known for alleged cattle mutilations, UFO, Sasquatch, and werewolf sightings, many investigators have claimed that the phenomenon has followed them home after visiting the ranch. Recently coined the hitchhiker effect. Investigative journalist George Knapp and Dr. Colm Kelleher, program manager of the DIA's AAWSAP program and authors of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, joins me to discuss Dr. Kelleher's 1998 private internal report for NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, focused on 4 possible hypotheses proposed at explaining the various phenomenon reported at the ranch. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. George and Colm, thank you for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. So recently, I just came back from a trip in the Uinta Basin myself with Micah Hanks, our editor-in-chief of the Debrief, and also has a podcast called the Micah Hanks Program. And we were talking to locals and doing some of our own research around Skinwalker Ranch and what the phenomenon that's been happening in the Uinta Basin. So a lot of people think that, Blind Frog Ranch and the Skinwalker Ranch are just where the phenomenon happens, but it really is throughout the Uinta Basin. So I would like to just start off easy and ask both of you, why do you feel that, Utah and the Uinta Basin is attracting the paranormal and is such a hot spot for it?
Well, there are multiple different hotspots in the United States. We at the National Institute for Discovery Science, we focused a lot of our attention on the Uinta Basin. And as you rightly say, it goes back, decades and decades. Junior Hicks is sort of a central player in that whole sort of scenario. And he became a high school teacher, I believe, in 1950, which is 72 years ago. Recently passed, but he sort of became an attractor for gathering information from the locals in the Uinta Basin. And sort of 40 square miles around the Skinwalker Ranch, he collected enormous amounts of data that was eventually published by Professor Frank Salisbury in his book, The Utah UFO Display, I believe it was called. But that was all the way back in the 70s. And, we interviewed Junior Hicks a lot, and his whole thing was he had gathered 400 reports from the locals over many years, but the locals had actually told him over 4,000 reports, and, he only took the top 10%, and the rest of it was sort of, okay, lights in the sky and unusual phenomena in general, but he kind of funneled everything down into 400 reports that became the basis for Frank Salisbury's book. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the Skinwalker Ranch is embedded in this area that goes back, prior to 1950. And, we originally, George and I, when we wrote Hunt for the Skinwalker, George did a lot of research in terms of how far it really goes back. And reports of these unusual phenomena go all the way back to the 18th century. So it's been sort of in this sort of league for centuries. Same goes with the area in northern New Mexico that National Institute for Discovery Science spent a lot of time in. That's the Dulce, New Mexico area. They go, these unusual phenomena and very, very high parallels with the Uinta Basin. Those phenomena go back decades also, but you've also got Yakima in Washington. You've got the San Luis Valley in Colorado. You've got probably a dozen areas in the United States that are scattered and that people have studied over decades. So what's common to all of that? I know that from our perspective, the sort of common feature for Skinwalker and Dulce, New Mexico, Yakima, were the presence of Native American reservations in the vicinity. You layer that on top of the sort of the Mormon central focus in northeastern Utah, and maybe you've got some sort of a perfect storm for cultural acceptance of the unusual. That may be part of it, or there may be physical aspects of the general topography in northeastern Utah. I know during the NIDS era, we did a lot of sort of analysis of, unusual gravitation phenomena around the Skinwalker Ranch. We looked at electromagnetic phenomena around the Skinwalker Ranch. We looked at hallucinogens being carried by the wind to see if people were actually ingesting peyote and not really figuring things out. The NIDS group all the time use bottled water. We never drank water from the locale because, just in case there were hallucinogens in the water, that were causing potentially people to see things that that normally they couldn't see. So I suppose the bottom line is that there's a sort of a congruence of both physical parameters, but also cultural parameters that give rise to these hotspots.
The NIDS guys did what they were supposed to do when they went in. There's no like game plan. How do you go investigate a UFO hotspot that's also a paranormal hotspot? They tried to do what scientists should do, is look for prosaic explanations. As Colm said, rule some things out, gravitational anomalies, psychoactive plants, did basic science stuff. But after that, what do? They were attracted by the UFO stories. Frank Salisbury's book, Junior Hicks's work, documented hundreds of cases, but both of those guys focused primarily on things were flying in the sky, orbs, lights, structured craft, a lot of really good cases, a lot of really well documented cases. But all the other stuff, the peripheral stuff, kind of got tossed to the side by both Junior Hicks and by Salisbury, certainly, even though they were reported there. There's no place like Skinwalker Ranch in the world in terms of how intensively it has been studied over a long period of time. Hasdalen in Norway has had an ongoing study, but again, looking at lights in the sky as opposed to the really strange phenomena that people have been reported there for a long time. How do you go about? What's the game plan to try to investigate something like that? These guys sort of kind of made it up as they went along. It is the most intensely studied UFO hotspot in the world, the ranch. But of course, as the NIDS guys learned when they came there to look for UFOs, there's a lot more going on, and it's not just confined to the ranch itself. It's throughout the Uinta Basin. Why there? I think at the end, by the time the NIDS part of the study was over, I remember talking to Colm and Eric Davis, and they sort of kicked around the idea, what if we threw a dart in the map and put these kind of resources into other locations? Just would you find, if you looked hard enough, would you find this everywhere? And the answer might be yes. We don't know.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Like from reading both books and looking at different reports, and you touched, Colm, a little bit on a report when you spoke about hallucinogenics. There was a paper that you did was completing medical psychiatric explanations for Utah ranch data in 1998. There was a little bit of this report that you didn't bring into either of those books. And I know you touched lightly on some of them, but you had 4 really strong hypotheses that, and a 5th one as well that we'll speak about, but you cite 4 off the hop. The first one being the brain tumor, a temporal lobe epilepsy hypothesis. Can we start and break down all 4 of those? And we don't have to go full into depth because I know we only have an hour, but what you find was really the key factor and what you found was so interesting and why you chose 4 of these hypotheses. And I'd love to start with the brain tumor and temporal lobe epilepsy hypothesis, if you can.
Well, is the report that you're referring to was a 1998 report, you said? And it was published. Where was it published? 1998 is now what, 24 years ago. So
it is
I'm
fair.
racking my brains.
Yeah, it says analyze full all Utah ranch data by 1998, and then it was Kit Green. And it says the purpose of this paper is to first discuss some of the involved testing and the hypothesis that were going on. So there, you've listed about this was given to me as well. And I wanted to speak with you on this and for sure what the valid, like if this is valid or not, because this is something obviously that is floating around. So when you're looking at, or should I ask you then, did you look at the brain tumor and epilepsy hypothesis? Like, is that something that you actually analyzed?
Well, we did look at the possibility. Brain tumors and temporal lobe epilepsy are sort of intertwined with this whole field, because there's a sort of a long history in the science literature of correlations between temporal lobe tumors and the experience of mystical type experiences, or people seeing things that other people don't see. So we definitely looked at that possibility, and that was very early in the NIDS days, when we only had a very, very small number of witnesses, i.e. the Gorman/Sherman family, that were sort of reporting all of this. But I mean, here we are in 2022, 24 years after this paper you're talking about was published, or was put out, and we now have dozens and dozens of different people from all walks of life, from scientific and engineering backgrounds, and from investigative backgrounds, including the United States government. The DIA sent five different people with backgrounds in the military to Skinwalker Ranch. All five of them encountered unusual phenomena. So, the more data that is accumulated over the decades since that report came out, the more unlikely temporal lobe. Not everybody's walking around with a temporal lobe tumor. So I mean, we are forced by circumstances to rule out that hypothesis, simply because the overwhelming number of people who have reported unusual phenomena, including the team that Brandon Fugel is heading, who started this new focus beginning in April of 2016. So I mean, you literally have dozens and dozens of independent witnesses now, whereas in 1998, when these hypotheses were being put out, it was only a handful of witnesses.
Right, that makes sense. And we're seeing that the high level, though, of brain tumors in the Uinta Basin is extremely high. When I was there, I was speaking with, children, with people and their family members that were having consistent tumors. And, to me, I know you say that there might not be as much validation to that, but as time goes on and you're seeing that these people are having real issues, it's a concern, obviously, and what is causing it. And we'll get into maybe some of those reasons later on. But, looking at that and then talking to people like Michelle Miners, who formerly worked at the ranch, and
Right.
she herself had an experience with Thomas Winterton, where she told me personally that they were in a room together in one of the houses. It wasn't one of the homesteads. I believe it was one of the houses that somebody lives on currently, and occupies it with their family. And she said that the entire room started to spin, and that Thomas Winterton and everyone felt this, and they felt they were in some kind of portal or like vortex, and they were standing still, but their vision was moving. Now, isn't that possible? That could be some form of mental health, mass hysteria, that's happening outside of something that's the phenomenon.
Again, I would go back to that was a valid hypothesis back in the 90s when NIDS started this investigation. We did list out a whole bunch of hypotheses. I believe paraphrenia was one of those hypotheses.
Right.
But again, given the enormous number of different people who are not indigenous to northeastern Utah, who actually came from elsewhere and then moved into the Uinta Basin for the purposes of investigating and documenting these phenomena. I would go back to this story that not everybody is walking around with a temporal lobe tumor, and there are issues associated with being in close proximity to multiple phenomena like this. There are medical issues that AAWSAP documented in great detail. And, there's no denying that there's been a long history of issues associated with these phenomena. But again, I would not sort of, I would not put the phenomena, the explanation for the phenomena in the basket of, you know, essentially mass hysteria or tumors.
At the time we're talking to you, Chrissy, it's the 75th anniversary of the birth of the flying saucer, the modern era. The day after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, it hits the newspapers, and that term gets tossed around, becomes a national sort of a furor. There were sightings all over the country. 75 years later, we still don't have answers to the big questions. What are these things? Where they're from? Who's flying them? What the intelligence, if it isn't intelligence, what their interest is in us. We've learned a lot, but we don't have answers to any of the big questions, despite a lot of resources from people like NIDS, the AAWSAP program, ATIP, the UAP task force. But I think there's another lesson in the Kenneth Arnold sighting, and one that Colm has written about, is Kenneth Arnold saw these things floating around. That wasn't the end of it. He took something home with him. Call it a hitchhiker. But there was an explosion of paranormal activity in his home. He saw it, his family members saw it, and it stayed with him a long time. You know, we've documented a lot of cases like that happened at the ranch, but it's not limited to just the ranch. This mystery is bigger than just lights in the sky, objects in the sky. We've come to the conclusion that we're never going to solve it just by studying radar returns and videos of fuzzy objects flying around in the heavens. You got to look at the total picture, and the total picture is pretty darn weird.
Yeah, I agree. It's so weird, and it gets weirder and weirder as you know, I dive deeper into this subject and look into Skinwalker. And I always wonder why Skinwalker, I'm so attracted to it because it's wild, the things that are happening and going on. You know, I want to go back to this report too with you, Colm, because, you know, we get into things that, you know, sometimes we're always trying to use science to prove if what's going on is actually happening and we can prove it. And what is this paranormal? You know, one of the other hypotheses that you have is the hallucinogen hypothesis. And I found this was really interesting because you did look at the way that wind currents were moving. You looked at from all different types of plants that were located in the Uinta Basin. And could that be possible? Can you talk a little bit about that? And then along with did you ever look into the thoughts that potentially there was burning of some type of bush? We know that when you burn a bush, there could be some type of hallucinogenic that would come off that. Was there any burning of certain psychoactive plants potentially in that area that might have caused certain hallucinations?
Well, we did, as you mentioned, we did first of all look at wind direction. And we looked at the correlation, because we accumulated pretty rapidly over time dozens of different anomalies that different people on the property had experienced. So we already had a sort of several dozen to match against, things like date and time, location on the ranch. And so we were able to very easily consult the weather data and track wind direction. So from a perspective of burning of plants and also wind direction of plants, we were able to essentially rule out the idea that there was windborne hallucinogens coming in, because it would have had to be from all 4 points of the compass. They would have had to be blowing strongly from north, south, east, and west, because all of the different times and dates that we had accumulated for the phenomena that had been already experienced on the ranch, and we're talking by 1998, when we had several dozen of these logged and documented, there was really no correlation between wind direction and the sort of the performance of these anomalies. Now, one other aspect that we looked at, I'm not sure if it's in that report or another one that we wrote, was the seismic hypothesis, which was very, very well documented by a USGS scientist. I think his name was Dr. Durr, and he had started looking at the correlation between earthquake lights and piezoelectric effects and seismic activity. And his hypothesis essentially was that seismic activity gave rise to piezoelectric effects, which caused ball lightning, these unusual sort of ball structures that float around. and they have been well documented and actually videoed in concert with seismic activity all around the world. So we're not talking about something that's fake. This is real stuff that has been documented. But what NIDS did was, again, with that relatively small data set of several dozen reports, we went to the University of Utah seismic database and the USGS seismic database. We had two different databases that we were correlating against, and we mapped out what the seismic activity within a 300-kilometer radius of the ranch was. And again, we had times and dates to correlate against. And again, there was no correlation whatsoever. And there was a lot of subsequent hypotheses about potential seismic activity and piezoelectric effects affecting people's temporal lobes. Michael Persinger had done some again, a Canadian scientist who had done some reports on that. And we looked at that possibility. But in the end, we actually, myself and Eric Davis wrote a pretty comprehensive report on that hypothesis. And the bottom line in the paper was that we had ruled out the seismic hypothesis also.
Also worth remembering, Chrissy, a lot of the things that happen at the ranch are physical. They're not mental. They're not psychic or psychological. These are physical events that really did happen, that left a mark, a measurable mark. I mean, animal tracks that were left, animal attacks, cattle that were carved up or would walk out into a snowbank and disappear, cats that were eviscerated. There was one incident that we described in the first book where these bulls were crammed into a trailer somehow, and then the entire corral was magnetized. It stayed magnetized for a couple of days. That was measurable. There were measurable physical effects on equipment, compasses that would spin around, batteries that would die, all kinds of equipment and cameras and failures. And then the incident where something invisible climbed up a telephone pole and ripped the guts out of this camera that was viewable from another camera. Whatever it did, it was invisible. There were physical things that happened there that were measurable, that were real, that weren't in people's heads, that weren't caused by magic mushrooms.
Yeah, that makes makes total sense. Also, back to the story that you were talking about with Hunt for the Skinwalker, when they were up on that telephone pole and they were pulling out those cords, and there was video of that
right.
There was nothing exactly. Have you released any of that video coverage, or will you release any of that for people to see? Or NIDS, or if Brendan, or sorry, if Robert Bigelow will potentially release that?
Well, that's a TBD, but that's all privately owned data and that's up to Robert Bigelow, who owns that data. I can't speak for him about whether or not that's going to be released, but he's the owner of that data, and he put several $1 million into putting scientific teams on the property and putting a lot of sensors on the property and accumulating that data. So that's a question for him. I'm not able to answer whether or not that's going to be released.
We tried, Chrissy. By the way, it's 2002, so it's 20 years ago. This year is when I wrote the first article about their work at NIDS, work at Skinwalker. And I've been trying to coax and cajole my friend Robert into releasing some of this stuff ever since. He's not so inclined. I mean, if you've ever met him, he's a pretty hard-headed guy set in his ways. So I don't think he cares whether the public gets a look at it or not. But we'd love to be able to show it to you. I'd love to have it.
Me too. I love to campaign for that. Let's go, Robert Bigelow. You need to release that so we can see it. You did talk about the seismic energy hypothesis, and that was one of the fourth ones. The last one I want to talk about is the remote manipulation hypothesis that you have. And that talks a lot about remote energy weapons and direct energy weapons potentially being used. This gets into really high conspiracy thoughts around MK Ultra potentially too. Where can you talk a little bit about that hypothesis, and then how this might be connected, and where people might have taken this into a conspiracy lane as well? Because when you connect energy weapons to, people are automatically, as in the UAP community, are probably going to scream MK Ultra.
Well, yeah, I mean that was certainly on the table as a hypothesis. The idea that there were, either United States government contractors or United States personnel or some other organization that may have been privately owned that were testing quote unquote toys in the vicinity of the Skinwalker Ranch. And that has been an undercurrent of sort of concern throughout all of the studies ever since we first got involved, which was in August of 1996. So this is what now 26 years later. It has been an undercurrent. There's been rumors of people that were encountered in the Uinta Basin that did seem to be associated with the military, but very, very sort of fragmentary, very elusive reports and anecdotes that cumulatively don't amount to an awful lot. In my personal experience, other people may have different viewpoints, but the cumulative sort of force of all of these anecdotes over time has not convinced me that there are people from Hill Air Force Base in Utah, for example, that are testing exotic weapons on unsuspecting United States citizens in the Uinta Basin. I have not seen enough evidence for that to take that seriously. But I am aware of the undercurrent that has come through for 2.5 decades. And obviously there's now a lot of sort of speculation about the Havana Syndrome and the overlaps between what people have experienced on the Skinwalker Ranch and other hotspots regarding this Havana Syndrome. Again, I have not seen the data. A lot of the medical data associated with the Havana Syndrome obviously is classified. So I personally haven't seen that data. So I'm not in a position to draw those correlations.
Here's what we can say though: NIDS did not conduct any secret weapons experiments on their own employees. AAWSAP did not do any of this stuff. Over the years, as Colm mentioned, we get little bits and pieces of stories of people who see men in black types and government helicopters and things of that sort in and around the ranch in the basin. That's happened. That has happened. And of course, there would be government interest in the ranch and what was going on there. There are some national security implications, but NIDS and AAWSAP weren't doing this stuff. There were foreign governments that we've learned that were expressed an interest in maybe partnering at the ranch and finding out what's going on there. Those entreaties were rejected. But look at it this way. This stuff's been going on since the late 1700s in the Uinta Basin. Before the Department of Defense existed, they weren't shooting energy beams back when the Spanish missionaries were floating through the Uinta Basin, or in the 1930s when people were seeing things on the ranch for the first time. So we never took that off the table in Hunt for the Skinwalker. So we sort of had the idea we can't take that off the table of some kind of military involvement. It might have happened for some of these instances or incidents, but the vast majority, the ones that were documented by NIDS and then by AAWSAP, do not involve some foreign government. The activity's been going on throughout the basin for well over a century, and even before the Department of Defense ever existed.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm imagining you've thought about this though too, of any type of manipulation or, connected to cattle mutilation, because it really is unbelievable how these animals are really just fully almost dissected and there's no drops of blood or anything else. Could that be used as some type of energy beam that could be doing things like that too? Is that a consideration?
Well, that going back to the March 10th, 1997 cattle mutilation, the mutilation of the calf on the property on the Skinwalker Ranch that we wrote about in Hunt for the Skinwalker. I mean, that was a sort of a well-documented event that happened in broad daylight with two witnesses about 100 yards or less away. The ranching family had just, or the two ranchers had just tagged these calves with bright yellow ear tags, 84-pound calves that had been born the night before, and they were about 100 yards away when their dog started acting weirdly. And then suddenly they were drawn back to the area where this calf was. It was lying on the grass, this calf that they had literally tagged 45 minutes previously. And again, it was 10 o'clock in the morning, bright sunny day in March of 1997. And this calf had absolutely no internal organs. It was lying perfectly positioned with, 4 legs out on the grass, its head, pointing up, and its spine was, white and sort of very healthy looking, and its entire abdominal cavity was empty. Its entire thoracic cavity was empty. I mean, it had ribs jutting up into the sky, kind of thing, but not a drop of blood on the animal, not a drop of blood underneath the animal. But we had 2 people within 100 yards of this thing, of this event, and the mother of the calf was acting very, very strangely. Was running back and forth near the calf, dragging one of its feet as if it had been injured. Very, very stressed and obviously very perturbed. But I go back to directed energy weapons can only accomplish a certain amount. I mean, the idea that all of the internal organs have been removed silently in broad daylight from this calf, and at the same time, no noise, no nothing, no disturbance. Even the dog, which was alerted originally, even the dog didn't notice what was happening for the majority of this event. And we thought that originally NIDS were contacted in Las Vegas. We were in Las Vegas. We took Robert Bigelow's private jet up from Las Vegas to the ranch, and we were standing over that animal within 6 to 7 hours of the event. So we went through the whole thing. We had a professional veterinarian on staff. We went through the entire thing, necropsy, and I mean, we looked. We went through the histopathology. We went through forensic analysis, and there were sharp instruments used on this animal. So we documented 2 separate types of sharp instruments. One was like a machete type instrument, and another was much finer. But bottom line, this was a physical event, unlikely to have been caused by directed energy weapons. It was just too sophisticated and too much of a physical interaction to be accomplished like that.
On the mutilations, the NIDS team, they had a rapid response team that went all over the U.S. on the Western U.S. When they get reports of these things, get in there, gather samples, analyze it, try to figure it out. Some of these are truly anomalous, like the one Colm just described. Others, Colm can get into more detail, but they found evidence that maybe there was a second group of mutilators, humans, who were tracking the spread of something through the food chain and operating under the umbrella of, well, weirdo cattle mutilations. Nobody's going to take it seriously. We can get away with this to carry out our nefarious ends to cut up animals and leave them on the side of the pasture, and nobody's going to really take a look at it. It's as if there were 2 different operations, one that's truly mysterious and one that sounds all too human.
I want to get into then your kind of last 5th hypothesis that you suggested, and it's the intelligence and this intelligence and non-human or maybe ET hypothesis. And then you talk about can you obviously break down what it is, and then you chat about what your recommendations would be around observation and communications, because I like to go in a little bit farther into that and where we would see that today, because I know that you talk about it in your last chapter of Revolutionary Science and where we need to go. But I'd first like you to talk about then the 5th hypothesis that you suggested, Colm. So when you suggest intelligence that is non-human, are you suggesting ETs in this case?
Not necessarily, but we if we place the Skinwalker Ranch in the context of the 75-year history, like George was saying, going all the way back to Kenneth Arnold, which is really sort of when the media sort of got sort of around this topic. So 75 years, if you put the Skinwalker Ranch in the context of all of that, you've got sort of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different cases, a lot of different metallic craft that even back in 1947 were displaying performance characteristics that were so far beyond what human capabilities are. And that sort of evolved over time. And then in 2004, AAWSAP investigated the Tic Tac case, which was displaying the same sort of out of this world kind of performance of craft. So one of our hypotheses of the performances that we were witnessing on Skinwalker Ranch was that the capabilities and the precision as associated with the performances on Skinwalker Ranch were potentially associated with some kind of an intelligence that was operating that was not necessarily human. Now, is that intelligence extraterrestrial? Is it interdimensional? Is it sort of a breakaway civilization of humans? I mean, there are so many different hypotheses floating around. I mean, I can honestly confess that the main focus of the National Institute for Discovery Science and the main focus of the AAWSAP group, boots on the ground, where it was gathering data, because what we're really sort of short on is data, hard data. And, we have endless speculation regarding what these possibilities are. But, the real key for any future UFO program as we go forward in 2022 is to really put the gas, press the gas on the process of accumulating data, because that's what really we need. Where we have a lot of hypotheses based on not too much really hard data, and that's really what separates the so-called science of ufology from the rest of mainstream science.
Mm-hmm. George, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, as I said earlier, we're 75 years from the start of the modern UFO era. We are no closer to answering any of the big questions. It's always just seemingly a little bit out of our reach. Who's responsible? I mean, the NIDS guys, AAWSAP, Brandon Fugel's team, I think they've clearly demonstrated there is an intelligence operating on the ranch, on or around the ranch, that some of these things happening are not natural phenomena. They're directed. It played mind games. It messes with them. It seemingly knows what people are going to do before they do it. One of the advantages of having Brandon in a TV show out there with his team is they can document the kind of things that happen to NIDS all the time that they weren't there to produce a TV show. They didn't have a camera to show the compasses going crazy, or you can demonstrate that equipment fails, that batteries die. All those little things that happen all the time are now being documented on camera, and that's great. But the answers to the big questions are still seemingly impossible to get. What is the intelligence? Where is it from? Crypto-terrestrial, ultra-terrestrial? It felt to us like it has been here a long time, that maybe it lives here. It's not from somewhere else, that it lives here. And, but, it's just guesswork. We don't know the answers to that stuff. Moving forward, though, as you gather more data, as Colm said, it's necessary to document what's flying around in the sky, but it's also necessary to follow the evidence where it led, which is where it leads, which is what AAWSAP did. It got into trouble sort of for following into some very weird paths down some very dark alleyways, but you got to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at things that are flying around and radar returns without looking at what happens to people, the physical effects, the psychological effects, the ongoing hitchhiker type effects that have been documented for a long time now.
Yeah, and I personally have a few issues with History Channel and the way that they are filming and documenting this scientific experiments that they're saying that they're doing, and I have a lot of respect for Dr. Travis Taylor personally. I know, George, you just came out recently saying that he was the head scientist at ATIP, at the UAP task force, and he wrote the recent report that came out. And so I have a lot of respect for what he's doing, and I think he's a wonderful man, but I have some questions when it comes to the way that they're actually doing their experiments. So, for example, there was one moment within the History Channel where the cattle were I believe they put llamas in, and they didn't have proper documentation. They didn't have proper cameras on that pen. And apparently then it was, if I was a pack of wolves, people, they were kind of alluding, as television does, to some form of skinwalker. But the science that they're doing there, I find, isn't as, it could be a little bit better than what they're working on now. And I go back to this report, Colm, because I think that you had some really great suggestions here. And when you look at observations and how things should be observated, and what type of camera systems that they should be putting in place, and where they should be doing this, along with then communication tactics that are a little bit more in the revolutionary science. Have you spoken to Dr. Travis Taylor, Colm, about this, and then potentially what they could do better? Because I personally think that NIDS might have done a better job in looking at this compared to what Brendan Fugel is doing right now. And no offense, Brendan, but I just feel that, and maybe History Channel is not showing us everything, obviously, but I feel that there is something here that should be communicated towards to Dr. Travis Taylor. Have you spoken to him about where he could go back next with observations and communications?
No, I have not. I'm sort of, I have not really focused a lot of my attention on Skinwalker Ranch since George and I sort of walked the property in the hours before it was transferred from Robert Bigelow to Brandon Fugel. Obviously, I'm aware of what has happened since Brandon Fugel's team, but I would also caution you that this it's a 500-acre property, and absolutely being on top of a phenomenon that doesn't obey the scientific method very well. It does not sort of lend itself to reproducibility. That was one of the factors that was intensely frustrating to the NIDS team, was that we would get data in a particular area of the property, and then we would set up, based on that, we would set up a lot of focus, including sensors and personnel. And then the next couple of days, we had realized that some major phenomena had occurred on the other end of the property, as a result of neighbors sort of reporting stuff to us. So it was always this cat and mouse game that has been ongoing, and I think this the current team are experiencing some of that too. That you're always one step behind something that seems to be able to predict what you're going to do, and also maybe listening into conversations that you're having and all of this. So it's a very challenging 500 acres to cover, and 500 acres is actually quite a lot of ground to cover, in terms of continuous observation and continuous recordings and all of that. So I guess in answer to your question, no, I haven't talked with Travis Taylor about this, but as President Clinton used to say, I feel his pain.
Yeah, Travis, I've talked to Travis a lot more in the last year than I have for the previous 5 years. And he admits, when I first met him, I think he felt that the whole thing was a scam, that NIDS had pulled off some kind of a scam, that they were either in league with bad actors or other governments or something, that he was going to go in there and expose it all and show that it's all made up. He's learned otherwise, but I think he and the team have learned that it is confounding, that what you think is going to happen doesn't happen, and whatever plan you have going in doesn't work the way you think it's going to. The duplication of efforts, nothing ever comes out quite the same. Whatever that intelligence is on that property and in the basin, it calls the shots. And you can try all you want to get a same kind of response each time you try the same experiment, and it'll be different. The transient radiation, for example, Travis was exposed to radiation. It caused some serious health problems for him, and there have been health problems for others. But the source of that radiation that caused very definite physical problems for him is gone. It's there 1 minute and gone the next. It affects him, but not somebody standing right next to him. So it's very confusing. It's very frustrating, and there is no basic scientific plan for how you attack a paranormal hotspot. And they're, you know, a lot of what they're doing is, let's try this and see what happens. It's almost like poking the bear to see what happens. Poke a hole in the mesa and see if it reacts. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, it's true. It's so wild. And you're right. How do you look at this into a scientific um explanation? And I know that you say in Revolutionary Science in Colm in the last chapter of the book that people need to be more open-minded, and the science community needs to be open-minded when doing this type of research. And maybe this isn't always for the science community. So I want to get into a little bit about your revolutionary science approach. You speak in this too, that, you know, and one of the suggestions is to hire a psychic to work alongside with the NIDS team for a month to document. And then also the next thing is the other part as well, is that you suggest that the NIDS team should meditate. And we obviously know, if you've read the book, what happens when you meditate on Skinwalker Ranch. So it disturbs or reacts, the phenomenon reacts to it. So can you break down two of those reasons why you feel that a psychic would be important, and then why collectively as a NIDS team you suggested for them to meditate? And then how would the science community look at this as a suggestion?
Yeah, and again, I do emphasize that report was written privately for NIDS, and it was focused on operational details that we intended to look at. But you know, we definitely had deployed remote viewers in context with the Skinwalker Ranch. It's a matter of public record that you know, Joe McMonigal has done a few remote viewing sessions on the property with very, very accurate results. Other individuals have also done remote viewing. There have been sporadic cases of psychics on the property, some of which I think are reported in the book, and some of which are not. But the bottom line is that yes, there has been psychic focus on the property, but I would emphasize again and again that no matter how strange and how bizarre that everything seems to be on this property and elsewhere investigating this phenomenon, that the scientific method is the bedrock of operationally going forward, because if you abandon the scientific method, and that's one of the things that NIDS and AAWSAP absolutely rigidly adhered to, you tend to go down tangents that it's very difficult to come back from that kind of thing once you deviate from the scientific method. So we did have Science Advisory Board with National Institute for Discovery Science, and we had every 3 months we would have site visits from the Science Advisory Board. And we would have to justify to the Science Advisory Board how we were operating on this property, you know, to mainstream scientists, basically. And they poked holes in our methodology. They poked holes in our preparation. They even poked holes on, you know, sort of the idea that we couldn't capture enough data, you know, quickly enough. So, but you know, we never deviated from the scientific method. And I do believe that no matter how strange and bizarre things can occur, that the scientific method as we go forward is the basic bedrock on which we need to operate.
I'll tell you this, I'll add this, Chrissy, is that during those days, before NIDS got onto the ranch, during and after, there were debates back and forth, some pretty heated debates by these giant brainiacs who were on the Science Advisory Board, and people like Colm and Eric who were working with NIDS about the approach. Should we go in there gangbusters and put cameras and sensors and equipment and personnel on the ranch, or just try to go in very quietly, no equipment at all, try psychics, try remote viewers, try meditating, just sort of a softer approach, and see if that works to establish communications? They had really pretty ambitious plans to try to communicate with this thing. And a couple of times during the NIDS study, they thought they were close to establishing communication, but it never quite worked out. So yeah, even while they were there on the property, there's a debate about the approach, which one would have worked best. And there are those who are on that NIDS board who don't think we should have ever made it public. They're still mad at Colm and I for writing the book, that it should have been kept pure and pristine so that it wouldn't be overrun by crazy UFO people and paranormal enthusiasts or TV producers for that matter, you know?
Yeah. And George, I'd love to ask you about that too, because you did write an article in the Path of the Skinwalker. And I believe that was in, I think it was in a local paper in Vegas, and it was a Vegas Mercury, I believe, if I'm right. And yeah, right. And do you now regret potentially doing that? Because it went international. You know, it was amazing and putting a spotlight what was going on. But did you ever have a moment where you thought, maybe I shouldn't have done that? And how is this going to affect the research that's being done and then potentially the local community?
If I had that thought, it was a very fleeting thought and it didn't last very long. I mean, that's my job. I worked on trying to get Robert Bigelow and Colm to open up about what was going on at the ranch for a couple of years before I ever published anything. And the only reason they finally gave me permission to do it is because the level of activity at the property had nosedived to the point where there wasn't much for them to do. I think they thought maybe me visiting the ranch might stimulate something. Colm used me as bait on my first visit there. They also hoped that maybe by bringing some attention to the property that was now, you know, whatever the intelligence was, didn't want to be hunted anymore, maybe it would stimulate some leads of other hotspots that they could go investigate instead. No, I don't regret it because so much attention has now been focused on it. People are talking about it, and there's a new ongoing television investigation. It was part of the reason that AAWSAP was created. It's because of the activity that happened at the ranch. If our colleague Jim Lakatsky hadn't visited the ranch, hadn't experienced, and then talked to Harry Reid and Robert Bigelow, there would not have been an AAWSAP, and there probably wouldn't have been a UAP task force or congressional hearings, no Tic Tac investigation, no New York Times story. None of that would have happened without the things that we did at the ranch. So I'm pretty happy with how it worked out.
You know, and I think people see it from all different perspectives. What about the local community? And this can be to either of you. You know, what have they said? Because I've spent time, you know, in Vernal for about 10 days, and wonderful community, like just unbelievable. Anyone listening, go to Utah. It's just unbelievable. And the views in the community and everything around it. And you see that I don't know if I would say struggle, but there is this conversation about, is what happening in Skinwalker real or not? How did your research, you know, Colm, and then George, you even reporting and speaking of this, how did it affect the internal community, and where kind of has it left them now?
I know during both the NIDS days and the AAWSAP days, you know, NIDS being 1996 to 2003, say, and AAWSAP being 2008 to 2010, they were both times when there was a lot of activity on the property. But, you know, in both of those times, we kept a very, very low profile. We did begin to interact with the local Ute tribe in near Skinwalker Ranch, and we had very good relations with the Ute tribe, and we talked to members of the tribal council, and a lot of it had to do with, you know, their experiences around the Uinta Basin and their experiences on different properties apart from Skinwalker Ranch. So, you know, we did establish, but it was all sub rosa, and we were not talking to reporters in the Uinta Basin at all. We were talking to the local people, the neighbors, from the perspective of what they had experienced. And both during the NIDS era and also during the AAWSAP era, we did methodically interview neighbors in the environment of the Skinwalker Ranch. And we did accumulate a lot of data to show that Skinwalker Ranch was not unique at all, that it was just as a part of a much bigger picture in the Uinta Basin. To be honest, I have not followed a lot in detail since the AAWSAP program closed down in December of 2010. I have not followed a lot of the activity in the Uinta Basin since then. So I don't know what the ultimate effects of these, I think George could probably answer that question a lot better than I could.
It's been a mixed bag since the beginning. You know, when I was first allowed to visit the property after those guys had been there for a few years, and I was given the okay to go ahead and start working on a documentary and fan out into the community to try to get people to speak to us. I had no problem finding others who had had anomalous experiences around the ranch or throughout the basin. It was problematic to get them to speak to me. There was suspicion of outsiders. There was suspicion of news media, of course, justifiably so. And there was a lot of suspicion about Bigelow and NIDS. What are those guys up to? Remember, this is before all the stories about what NIDS had investigated and experienced on the property, before all that came out, before Terry Sherman, the Gorman family's experiences were widely known. So it was tough. It was a tough nut to crack in one sense. But when you could get them to open up, the people who lived there, I found a no shortage of people who had had their own experiences, sightings, UFOs, paranormal activity. If you could get them up to open up to you, they'd speak. I would also add this, that AAWSAP, Colm and I have reported with Jim Lukatsky as much as we can about what happened in that program. Took us 14 months to get our book through DOPSR through the Pentagon censor process. There's a lot more that has not been made public, including what happened at the ranch. It wasn't what happened during AAWSAP at the ranch wasn't really at the ranch. It was the environment around the ranch. They had investigators fanning out to win the confidence of people who lived near the property, get them to open up. And the stories they heard are mind-boggling, scare the hell out of you. Those kind of things that they saw. Once they would open up and were assured that their names would not be made public and that they could trust the investigators, they told them some stories that we have not been able to make public yet, but that we hope will someday be released.
You spoke about working with locals, like Junior Hicks is one of them that worked and did about over, you said 1,000, but I remember reading 400 different observations. And he was a local science teacher too, which some people might not know. And unfortunately has passed away. But was there other people? You do mention in the report that Pete Pickup was somebody that was working alongside Junior Hicks. Was any of the locals working with NIDS quietly and investigating this? And was Pete Pickup one of those people?
Yes, we had Pete Pickup was on the staff of NIDS for a few years, and he did a really good job. He was a retired police officer and also retired Marine, and he had very, very good rapport with the local people. So yeah, he interacted with a lot of the locals. He found out in the community in a completely separate sort of direction than what we were doing in terms of we were methodically interviewing people around the immediate area of the property, but Pete Pickup had much bigger range of people that he was talking with, and he accumulated over time many interesting reports of unusual phenomena that were much more far-flung from the immediate property. So yes, I mean, he was part of the accumulation of the large data set that comprised the Uinta Basin. So Junior Hicks, obviously, like I mentioned, his 400 reports had been culled from 4,000 reports, and he, as George mentioned, eliminated a lot of the paranormal associated reports from what he was doing. His only interest was in the quote unquote nuts and bolts reports that were happening in the Uinta Basin. So his 10% report of the full scope of what was happening in the Uinta Basin were all focused on nuts and bolts, craft, shiny metallic objects that local people were seeing. But he threw out 90% of that data on the much more disturbing paranormal effects that were going on in parallel with these nuts and bolts craft.
I would add this about Pete Pickup. I interviewed him. I think I saw him the first couple of times I was at the ranch, and then interviewed him on camera in 2003, sitting around a campfire. He was at the property while he was an active police officer. There were reports of things in the sky and then cannibal mutilations that he investigated as a cop. His wife had experiences at the ranch, saw something over the ranch, a structured craft. So he had experiences before he worked for NIDS, and then gathered a lot of other additional information as a police officer about strange things that had happened in the basin. And then again, while he was active with NIDS, got more information. So he was a great resource and a credible guy. In addition, there were tribal police officers that the NIDS guys interviewed, details of which have never really been made public yet. It took a long time to break through and gain their trust, but the stories that they shared were incredible. And then the last names I want to mention are Richard and Jean Dietz. They were the caretakers on the property through NIDS, through AAWSAP, into Brandon Fugel's era. They lived on the ranch longer than anybody. They had experiences. They never talked because they're under a non-disclosure agreement that Mr. Bigelow had them sign, but they live with it every day. They saw some really strange stuff and finally sort of learned to live with it. They had no choice. If they're going to live there, they had to learn how to get along with whatever it was. They're amazing.
Right. It's unbelievable. And, the locals, I think, unfortunately, in both shows from Blind Frog Ranch and Skinwalker Ranch, because if somebody doesn't know, they are about 30 minutes from each other on either sides of, I believe, east or west. And they're very close to each other and both have apparent phenomenons or alleged phenomenons happening. But, I think the local people do play a really big part in this. So with that said, what would you change? What would you do different than both yourself and George? And before my last question, I ask you, but what would you have done differently now if you had to look back?
I guess from the perspective of AAWSAP, it was really unfortunate that the AAWSAP program was terminated abruptly at the end of 2010, because the original intent was to go forward with a five-year program that would accumulate all of this data over time. There was an enormous amount of logistical issues that went into the AAWSAP program, setting up all of the security clearances for everybody, setting up the security infrastructure, which is the kind of thing that normally takes years that were accomplished in months. Hiring 50 full-time people for AAWSAP normally takes a couple of years. We accomplished it in 4 to 5 months. So we were on a very, very fast track, and we had essentially contracted with a lot of different laboratories in order to do everything from metallurgical analysis to DNA analysis to tissue analysis, right across the board. Setting up those contracts is not trivial, and setting up those relationships with laboratories is not trivial. So by the time the end of the AAWSAP program, suddenly the doors came down at the end of 2010. We were a well-oiled machine with 50 full-time people who are dedicated 100% of their time to working on this problem, both not only, by the way, on Skinwalker Ranch, but we were deploying people in Montana, we were deploying people in California, we were deploying people in Texas, in New York State. We deployed 2 separate teams over to Brazil, Fortaleza, Brazil, and Brasilia. So we were covering national and international cases, and we were moving very, very quickly when the doors shut, when the program was not renewed. So I guess my perspective is that the AAWSAP program, if it had been allowed to continue for another 3 years and accumulated the kinds of data that we were, truncated after 2 years, if we had been allowed to do that for another 3 years, for a total of 5 years, I think we would have gone a long way to really having a lot of pristine, robust data that might have even attacked this whole reproducibility problem in this field. We also accumulated a very, very large data warehouse, again, over 2 years. But if we'd been allowed to extend that for another 3 years, we had a lot of plans for artificial intelligence interrogation of different aspects of the data warehouse. That never came to fruition because the doors shut down. So I guess, if it was possible to do something different, I would advocate for a program like AAWSAP that was running on all 4 cylinders to be allowed to run for 5 years as opposed to 2 years.
Right.
And again, as my suggestion, as I mentioned already, is you can't just study nuts and bolts craft and get answers to these ultimate mysteries. You have to follow the evidence where it leads, which is the great strength of what AAWSAP was doing. They went there looking for UFOs, possible national security implications, technology. Can we duplicate this stuff? Can we, figure it out? But they also followed the evidence of all this other weird stuff that happened on the periphery. You need to look at the big picture to figure it all out. I'm interested in what it is that's flying around and how that technology works, but I'm not a scientist. I get access to people with big brains like Colm and can pick up information from them on what will work. AAWSAP would have worked. They were looking at the big picture. If there's a way to improve it, it might be in the sense of reporting it, how it goes up the chain, because as we wrote in our book, the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, it caused some problems. This stuff is pretty weird. And if it's not packaged in the right way, it can cause problems for the survivability of the budget and the program. People were worried about getting embarrassed, and it ended up on the coverage of the front page of the New York Times. So maybe how it's reported up the chain to higher ups could be improved so that the emphasis isn't on the weird stuff. It's more on the technology and the provable national security implications. But you need to look at the whole picture, whether it's going to freak people out or not.
Yeah, exactly. And looking at if we've opened up Pandora's box is a scary thought. My last question I'm going to ask you as well to both of you is this whole concept of, again, I go back to the local community because I think it's really important that they are there's a spotlight on them because they are wonderful and they do play a really important part, I think, in both Blind Frog Ranch and Skinwalker Ranch stories. But there is this conversation of a potential cover-up. And so we know that there's been lots of phenomenon that's happening, but we also have major stillbirth rates are really, really high in Utah. There are major amounts of tumors that are going on. There's one of the largest methane leaks in the world right now. Methane leaks in North America right now that's happening in Utah. Are these actually things that are affecting, and we have corporate companies and potentially government using climate and pollution issues and using the paranormal and saying that this is paranormal and it's covering up those actual issues that need to be addressed? Because there are problems that are happening in Vernal and around in the community that haven't been talked about, that people are getting affected, but are they using paranormal to cover this up? And would you, either of you, agree or disagree with that?
I'll tackle that first. Those two are not mutually exclusive. You can investigate the paranormal and investigate environmental crimes at the same time. There are some interesting questions. I've done a lot of stories about the downwinders, the effects of nuclear testing that took place here in Nevada, and all the tumors and cancers and deaths that it caused, both in rural Nevada and in all over Utah. Those effects were long lasting. You've got Dugway Proving Ground that has been the repository for all kinds of really bad stuff over the years. Could that have got into the water? You have physical effects, environmental effects of decades and decades of mining and oil drilling and things of that sort in that basin. Did hydrocarbons as got into the water? Has that caused long-term health problems? All of those things can and should be investigated, but it's not mutually exclusive to diving into the paranormal aspect as well. There's no reason you can't do both. And if anybody's trying to present it that way, they should be exposed for that.
Interesting. I agree. Colm, what's your thoughts on that?
I agree with George. I think they're not mutually exclusive. And if there are organizations using the paranormal, the paranormal sort of stigma to limit investigation into these other aspects, then I'm definitely all for exposing that too.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you guys. So I have so many other questions, but we are over time and our time is up. And I always say to everybody, thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me today on the show.
Thanks, Chrissy. We'll do it again.
Thank you.
I love that.